Please welcome Laura Poitras. Thanks, Laura. Thanks for being here.
It's really such an honor to show this film at this festival. But actually, before you dive in, there are people who are in the film that I'd like to acknowledge and thank. So I believe Glenn Greenwald is here. Where's Glenn? William Binney. Ewan McCaskill, I believe, is here. David Miranda. And I think that's it. If I'm missing, I think that's for who's here. And I wanted to do one other thing that we couldn't do last night. We after the premiere is to, and it's actually also somewhat relating to the film, is to thank the funders who supported this film, and they came on board in the most unusual circumstances, because when we approached each of them, we asked them to be incredibly discreet about the film and about the contents of the film. All of them made trips to Berlin to watch the cut. They, in some cases, didn't actually know what the final film would be until the end. We had redaction scenes that we showed because for source protection reasons, until we were ready to release it. And I know for the New York Film Festival, we did a screening for the festival committee, and we scheduled it here, but then we moved them to another location, and we had the end was redacted and some other things. So everybody has been, everyone who supported this film has taken an enormous leap of faith, and it has kept confidences that we've asked them to keep for the purpose so that we could do our work as securely as possible until we were ready to release it. So I'm grateful to all the people who supported this film, not just for their support, but for their sensitivity to the demands of this film. So I am going to have to name them. So first and foremost, Radius, who's distributing the film. Tom Quinn came to Berlin in February, and he said, and he'd heard about the film and knew we were working on it, and said that he wanted to be involved. And we showed him some footage, and they've been extraordinary in their support and in not, I think their instinct as distributors, like, shouldn't we announce that we're involved in it? And they, totally listened to what we needed, which was to remain as discreet as possible for as long as possible. Participant media. Diane Weierman is a dear friend, and we've known each other for years, and she was one of the biggest supporters on the film that I made in Iraq. And I worked with her when she was at Sundance right after I came back from Baghdad, and I was in I was still shell-shocked from the experience, and she supported that film, and we've always wanted to work together and never really knew how we'd make it happen. And she made a trip to Berlin, I think, in the festival, and we talked, and she said, this is something I think we could do. This is a film about journalism, and she went to the people she works with and said, we're going to fund a film, but you're not going to know anything about it. You're not going to know the title of it. You're not going to have any details. And they came on board, and so I'm incredibly grateful to Participant for their trust. HBO documentary films. I don't know if Sheila's here. Okay, anyone from HBO? Okay, so this was extraordinary that they've come on board. I mean, Sheila saw the film and loved it, and she's a champion of verite filmmaking, and I think it spoke to her. But she's also been so extraordinary in supporting our desire to have a theatrical life for the film. So, Bertha Foundation and BritDoc have been one of the first supporters, and Jess Church has been tireless in her support for this film and getting it into the world. Channel 4 is also one of was a broadcast supporter in the UK. David Menschel and Vital Projects Fund. David is the executive producer and has been supporting some of the most progressive documentary films. And I have only 3 more. So NDR and BR, which is our broadcaster in Germany. They've approached us immediately. I mean, much of the reporting that I've done has been based in Berlin, and they've been, tireless in their support. And CineReach. So I'd like to thank them, and Sundance. So thank you so much. And okay.
There's a lot to talk about, but I'll start with a big multifaceted question. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about just balancing the needs between reporting and breaking a news story and being part of that story and also making a film.
And do you mean that like in terms of what's in the film, or sort of working both reporting and making the film at the same time? Right.
Because you were in that hotel room, and obviously you did release, video, and were part of that. You were part of that story breaking a little over a year ago, but at the same time you had this longer-term film in mind. Yeah,
I mean, it's been a complicated sort of navigating roles while making this film. I mean, in the months when I was receiving the emails from Snowden, I was also in the process of making a film about surveillance, and I had an idea that, of course, this would find its way into that film. And I was very much, that relationship was, a source-journalist relationship, and he was claiming to have evidence of NSA surveillance. But when it sort of became clear that I would meet him, and I should contextualize it, for a long time I thought that I was in dialogue with somebody who was an anonymous source, that I would never meet, never knew who they are, that I would receive documents, and that I would team up with people and we would report. I think it was in April where he communicated to me that, in fact, his identity would be revealed, that he didn't intend to remain anonymous, and that his identity would be revealed. And both because it would be, discovered, and because he didn't want to remain in the shadows. And when he told me that, is when I sort of said, okay, well, as a filmmaker, then I said, then really we need to meet, and I want to be able to film you. And his first response was no. He said that the story isn't about him, it's about the issues, and that he wanted that to be what people focused on. And I responded by saying that, well, the fact that he's putting his life on the line to reveal this information was very important for the public to know, and that only he can answer that question, and that the documents won't speak to that. And he also had a serious concern that if he had taken these enormous risks to make this information available, and he was concerned about us being in the same place at the same time, because there was a risk that if we got shut down, that the information maybe wouldn't reach the public. So that was he had a security concern about actually physically meeting. But I was able to convince him of the importance that only he could speak to the motivations of coming forward, and that he, even if he chose not to be part of the story, he would be, because the press would report on him. So then he agreed to meet. And so when I went to Hong Kong with Glenn and Ewan, I was very clear that my job was as a documentarian, like as a visual journalist, that I wasn't there to look at to study the archive or to report on it. At that moment, I was there to document this moment of journalism, really, and how Glenn and Ewan worked with him in receiving this information and reporting on it. And that I felt that if there's anything I could contribute to understanding this, that's sort of what my whatever unique skill sets were, where their their writing and the reporting would break the news, where I would sort of document this historic event that was happening in Hong Kong. And so I was very clear that's what my role was. I wasn't looking at the archive or reporting. But then when he went underground and I returned to Berlin, it was very clear that I had an obligation to report. I mean, that he had put risked so much, and that I had to then sort of shift my focus and look at the archive and report on it. And that's when I started teaming up with Der Spiegel and other news organizations to report. But there has been this strange, push-pull, like you see, we are reporting on the Merkel story, and I'm also filming. I mean, everything about this film is kind of, looped in on itself, and I mean, that's very much why it was necessary that the film have a subjective voice, in it, so that the audience knows that I'm not an outsider, that I'm also a participant in the events that are unfolding.
Could you talk about that a bit, actually, because this is the third film in your post 9/11 trilogy. And I think it differs from the other two in several significant ways. I think the most obvious one being that you are a participant in the story, and you are not present in the other two films. Can you talk about the thought process and how you arrived at?
Yeah, sure. I mean, not unlike Snowden, I actually didn't want to be in this film, as my editor, as Mathilde, would testify to. That I had to be, but it was clear that I had to be, that I had to be present in the film, because the audience had a right to know that I was a participant in the events. But the question of how to be sort of subjective, it's a complicated one for these three films. When I made the film in Iraq, I was filming with Iraqi civilians, and it was a very dangerous time to be working in Iraq. But I didn't want the focus be on the Western journalist, in a dangerous conflict zone, because then sort of all the empathetic energy could sort of move towards me rather than the people that I actually wanted to be the focus of the story. So in Iraq, I absolutely didn't want to draw any attention to the circumstances of how I was working or any risks that I might face, because it was about having people understand what the occupation is like from the perspective of Iraqis and the U.S. military. So I'm very invisible in that film. I mean, I always think that, obviously there's a camera there, so I'm sort of part of it. I've been invited, so I'm present. With The Oath, it was actually a complicated one. I approached it in the same way, which is sort of a verite, where I'm sort of, watching scenes unfold. But Jonathan Oppenheim, who edited it, at some point we were doing test screenings before we finished, and he was aware there was an uneasiness amongst the audience that we didn't acknowledge the presence of the camera because the access was sort of so unusual, and sort of like, how is there a camera here? So we realized that we were taking the viewer outside of the story by not acknowledging the presence, my presence. So he then changed and put my voice in a few things. And so, and this one, it begins with, I think this film begins with I was placed on a watch list, et cetera. And so it's certainly the first film that I've done from first person.
Can you maybe backtrack a little bit and talk about how this project emerged and where it was going before Snowden arrived before that first email? I know that the idea was to make a film about surveillance, which obviously is a large, abstract, invisible subject. And what were you doing I know you've been working on this since The Oath, and what were you doing in the years before? And obviously I think some of the figures that you were following are still in this film, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, this film actually began in the spring of 2011, and I was interested, in the theme of surveillance. It was also when WikiLeaks was coming out, and I was interested in the work that they were doing, which also related to journalism. So I was interested in these themes, and I was working on trying to figure out what access. I mean, oftentimes my work, it's about, there's some themes I'm interested in, and then it's like trying to figure out how I can, follow, or what will take me on a journey that will help me understand those things. And so, but in the spring of 2011, I didn't quite know, but I was really interested in this, this guy who was blogging for Salon.com, and he was down in Rio, and he was, I was reading him all the time, and he was just doing this really fierce journalism, totally outside of the mainstream, and I loved his work, and I didn't quite know what the film and how it would come together, but I said, well, okay, why don't I get on a plane and spend some time with him. And so that's when I first filmed with Glenn, and I was with Kirsten Johnson, the cinematographer, and it's the opening. It's turns out to be the opening of the film, and he's at that very moment writing about Jane Mayer's article about Thomas Drake, who's an NSA whistleblower who was at that point facing espionage charges. So ironically, that's how sort of the very, very first shoot. And then sort of the film expanded. I actually reached out to Bill Binney at exactly that time, right after the New Yorker piece broke. So I actually called Bill from Rio. So the sort of origins happened there. But then I started expanding, and I did a lot of filming with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and also Jacob Appelbaum, who you see in the film, the Tor Project. And I was very interested in, surveillance, resistance movements, people who are working, activists. I mean, this was sort of in the aftershock of the Arab Spring. So I was filming in Tunisia, where Jake was working, and also Egypt. And then, so we were actually, Mathilde and I were editing, that film, and then Snowden started to email. And what happened was, I mean, in the end, we realized, in the editing room, we realized we actually have two films. There was that because of the material that I shot around Snowden and the way that Hong Kong we knew would occupy a large piece of the film, it kind of dictated what this film would be. Like for a while we had a lot more material before we arrived at Hong Kong, and then it was very hard to shift gears. It was like you opened a different story, midway through, and so we realized that there were two films, and that this one was going to sort of focus on Snowden. But it was a decision that we made in the editing room that there's material for two films.
Can you talk a little bit about shaping the material in the hotel room, which I think it's a full hour of the film. It's sequenced chronologically, but I think it's just amazing how it's shaped, in terms of like how you allow for humor to come into it as well, and the sense of suspense as that sequence plays out. How much did you shoot?
I mean, in terms of the structure of this, I mean, I don't, Mathilde is here, my extraordinary artistic collaborator on this film, who's, please. And I actually would say, like, she should come down and actually address. I mean, I would love to invite you down to answer that question. I mean, I can say she's walking down. After I came back, I mean, it was a kind of a traumatic shoot in the sense that the stakes were really high in the room and not knowing, and so she was the one who sort of took the footage and was the first one to watch it before then I, started to see when she made selects. So.
Yeah, what was the question?
In terms of how the shaping of the Hong Kong material and how, the structure and how much material.
Yeah, I think we had I didn't really count the hours, but I think we had something like 20 hours of footage for Hong Kong. Maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but that's around the time we had. And what was particularly difficult about it was that it was all extraordinary. All of it was completely extraordinary. We could have taken anything more or less, and it would have been shocking and beautiful. So the difficulty was to make choices, knowing that we left out passages that would have been also mind-blowing. That's one of the aspects of it. But of course, very soon, what we also noticed was that we needed to follow a very clear narrative line, which was that of a story unfolding in that verite style, which is almost like a fiction film. You follow things as they happen. And the more we did that, the more we started to understand that we could not go into certain directions. For example, we had to steer clear from opinions, statements that Snowden made that were very beautiful and that were very compelling also in what he's, because of course you notice he's extremely articulated and very thoughtful person. And so he made extraordinary statements that we were very tempted to use, but then after a while we noticed that we could not use them because it was taking us out of this narrative form that we were finding. So that was one of the main discoveries we made. And right, and then of course after a while we had to streamline what we were saying. With
We'd love to take some questions from the audience. Okay, many hands. You do? Okay, great. So is somebody going to call in the audience, or should I? I will? Okay. Let's start there. Yes? Please wait for the microphone. Wait for the microphone. The microphone's right there.
First of all, thank you very much for this movie and for this documentary. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit. In two occasions, Snowden talks about the drone program and its effect on his decision-making. Could you say something more about it, or how he articulated the reasons for his reaching out to you?
I mean, you know, I think the reference that we included where he says that, you know, one of the motivations is you know, being in the NSA and seeing, you know, the escalation of the drone program and also, you know, how he articulates that, you know, a hope like that some of these policies would be reined in and they weren't, and that there was these kind of escalations in certain policies, and so it's actually really what you know, we show you what he says on that, which is that it's one of the things that brought him forward was about the drone program. And I can say, obviously, it's echoed at the end, you know, when it's brought, when somebody else also comes forward to expose this program.
Hi, thank you for your bold filmmaking. I was just curious, how does Edward Snowden feel about living now in Russia?
I mean, in general, I avoid speaking on his behalf. I mean, I think though, but I think you can say that I think he's grateful to have political asylum. I think he's not aligned with, you know, all of the political reality there. But I think that he made the choice that he, you know, didn't feel that staying, you know, in the U.S. was an option for him. So I think he's, you know, but I think he's also, I think he's keeping options open if there are other possible countries for him to seek asylum.
Yes. Am I on now? So my question is, I didn't understand the urgency to put stories out while you were in the hotel room, because none of those stories were, to my perception, time sensitive. So my question is, why wasn't more care given to the plan for what would happen to ensure Snowden's safety rather than, I mean, all of a sudden there was this crazy environment created. I didn't understand the reason for that. Does my question make sense? And then related to that is, was there really, really no plan beyond what we see in the film for what Snowden would do to ensure his safety?
Right, okay. I mean, I think that in terms of a timeline, I mean, let me step back and say that I didn't know that he was leaving the country until he had actually already left. You know, we were in dialogue. I'd come back to New York to set up a time to meet him, thinking I was going to, you know, suburban Maryland or something. And then he left the country. And I think that that's actually when the time started, you know, ticking in terms of you don't leave the country and you know, work for the NSA without it being noticed. And so there was a bit of urgency in terms of publishing, because his absence would be noticed. And then in terms of his, like what we knew of, or what I knew of his, you know, what he was going to do next. I mean, my experience until working with him was, like, as a source, he would tell me something, which would then tell me what I needed to know to, you know, like he said, you know, I'm going to have information, and then he said, well, here is where you can download it, and etc. And then I actually thought that maybe I just didn't know what the next step was, is part of the answer. And yeah, what you see, and then I realized, or what we realized in Hong Kong, is that all of his planning did actually end there, you know, that actually was. And that when, you know, the lawyers came in, that you know, they then helped him, you know, go underground. And so, but in terms of the time, I mean, I think that, and you know, and Glenn can also speak to this, I think there was a need like that it was important that we publish and quickly, because to get the story out and to sort of have the public awareness of it unfold. And I can say one other thing. That since he had decided that he would reveal his identity, we actually wanted to do that before it was announced by the government. And it's clear that as soon as Glenn's Verizon story, that's when they come to Lindsay's and his home. So we knew that the government was aware that he was missing, and so we wanted we wanted him to have the first chance to say why he did what he did.
Yes, Laura, I'm wondering if did you encounter any problems coming back into the U.S. this time for the screening, or have you had any kind of bounce back personally from Big Brother on all of this?
I've had years of being stopped at the border, and actually I stopped being interrogated at the border in 2012, actually, after Glenn wrote a piece about it, and they did stop doing that. And in terms of coming back, I didn't have any problems, and I haven't been contacted by the U.S. government regarding this reporting.
I think this is going to be the last question, but just a reminder that we have a talk with Laura at 4 o'clock as well.
Hi, Laura. I and my organization represent a number of civilian victims of drone attacks, people at the sharp end of the chain that you show at the end of your program. And there's something about the movie I have a hard time sort of reconciling, which is that you guys have exposed a system that is unbelievable in its sophistication and its power. I mean, the kind of short version is that we all live in the panopticon, right? But the civilian victims of drone attacks are an example of the limits of that system and the way that, notwithstanding how powerful metadata collection is, the mistakes are made. And what I can't understand and what I can't reconcile is, how does that happen? To you, does it speak more to the indifference of the United States government to the lives of people in Yemen and Pakistan who die, or to the limits of the technology, or some mixture of both?
I mean, the mistakes. I mean, let's just say. I mean, I would say that the drone program, whether or not they. I mean, it's outrageous that we have a drone program that we're targeting people and killing them, whether or not is based on metadata or anything. That we think of democracies as having something called the rule of law, and that's what the drone program will never align itself with that. But in terms of, I mean, I think they're actually, there is indifference to civilian. I mean, we know that from, I spent time in Iraq. There is indifference to civilian casualties, and hopefully that changes, and hopefully we'll continue to do reporting that will hopefully have some impact and raise awareness for the civilian consequences of, particularly the drone program.
That's all the time we have for, but Laura, thank you very much for being here. Thank you all for coming.